Very good.
We're 6:30. I'll just let you know I'm Donna Coffin. I've been the one chatting with you folks. I work in Piscataquis and Penobscot County Extension offices, and I also work with John Jemison. He's our Extension Professor for Soil and Water Quality, and he agreed to do our program tonight called Growing CBD Hemp in Your Garden. Growing and Utilizing CBD Hemp in Your Garden. So I'll turn it over to John.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Donna, for setting this up. I am an extension professor of soil and water quality, and I have had an interest in this plant for a long time. And so tonight, what we're hoping to do is give you a little background. We're going to talk a little bit about what this plant is, a little bit of its history, the botany of it. We're going to talk about what makes it a unique plant and how it influences us. And then we're going to spend a fair amount of time on how to grow it, and then a little bit on how to utilize it and what I think is probably the healthiest manner that we can do this. And I do want to make a caveat that I think this plant can be a very healthy plant and helpful plant for us. I think it's part of it fits well with a good lifestyle, good diet, exercise, sleeping well, and all of those things. I think if all of those things are off, I'm not sure this plant is going to completely turn things around for anybody. But I think in that other perspective, it is a good part to an overall plan. I also would recommend that you realize I am an agronomist and I have no medical background, and so I would always recommend that you work with your health professionals to see how this may work for you or otherwise. I have a couple of conundrums with this plant in that I've been working in this field for 30 years, and I've been in agriculture really for about more than 35 years, and so for the longest period of time, I never would have dreamed I'd be doing a presentation on this plant at all, because it's been illegal. But recently, low THC hemp has been legalized across the country. The 2018 Farm Bill has really opened that door, and in that bill, low THC hemp has been made, it's no longer a Schedule I drug, and we'll talk about what a Schedule I drug is in a little bit down the road here. High THC cannabis, on the other hand, remains a Schedule I drug. So federally it's illegal, but on the state level of Maine, it is legal for people to grow it. And as an extension specialist and someone that gets part of its funding from the federal government, I want to make sure that you understand I'm not really trying to promote people going out and growing high THC cannabis. However, on the same respect, there is no question in my mind that high THC cannabis can have some healthful benefits to people, particularly if they, and I'll go into what some of those things are. But I just want to make sure that people know I'm not really out trying to promote this. I would also say in the same breath that there has been a medical cannabis program in the state for many, many years, and a good many people take advantage of it because I learned recently when I was watching the news that medical cannabis brings in to our state a tremendous amount of tax dollars. It's second is an important thing for many people, and that's an interesting thing. The other thing that I think is kind of interesting is that because it's been federally illegal for so long, we've lost a ton of opportunity to do research with this plant to see where it really could be beneficial to us. but there has been some research done. And so where I have documented and citable information for you, because that is my job as an extension specialist, is to bring you research-based information to help you make decisions and things. And so where I have that, I'll have that documented. And if I don't, then either I don't have it or I just haven't found it yet. But what I do hope to do is give you a little bit of my own personal experience on growing the plants, what I've learned from other growers that grow the plant, and I hope we have a really good time this evening. So with that, I'll get started. And I do think cannabis has been truly one of the more maligned plants in my lifetime anyway. And I think it's unjustly deserved. I teach a food systems class at the University of Maine, and we always used to talk about like what caused people to leave that hunter-gatherer lifestyle and become sedentary and do slave labor in fields and grow plants and things like that. And we used to think it was partly because perhaps people had the best land and they could grow the best grains, and then they figured out how to ferment those grains and give people alcohol, and that would keep them there to keep them going. I really like this comment by Carl Sagan, who said, wouldn't it be really interesting if in the history of, in human history, the cultivation of marijuana generally led to the invention of agriculture and thereby to civilization. And Carl Sagan's not a lightweight, so it is kind of conceivable that this plant could have played a role in this overall game. But we have been using this plant for just millennia after millennia, and for more than 5,000 years in recorded history, there are people talking about using the plant for benefits, particularly medical benefits in China, India, Greece, Iran. It's been grown in our country since the founding, since we really founded in 1600. Most of it was done for fiber production and making sales. And I worked with a gentleman back in 2016 about, I was working with a breeder who had some plants that he thought the source of his hemp for fiber was from some of the original settlers back when they settled in Canada. But it's been in medical use in our country for many years, and from about 1850 to 1930, it was used a lot in different kinds of pain relief, things like neuralgia or nerve pain. And I always thought it was funny that it was used in China for absent-mindedness. I don't know if that helped or hurt, but but anyway, at least in the United States, it was particularly prescribed for things like muscle spasms, convulsions, and epilepsy. So I think that was kind of interesting. And as a person who has had problems with back spasms and things since I was a teenager, and I once had an epileptic seizure on the way to work and woke up in the hospital and spent a week there. And so I was always interested in this plant to see if there may be a way for it to be helpful to, hopefully I never go back to that place again. And so for years it was a positive thing, and we have to sort of figure out why was it made such a maligned plant. And I think we can blame this particular character, Harry Anslinger. He was involved in prohibition, and then once prohibition was changed with the amendment, he needed something to do, and so he began to work and trying to malign or make cannabis he was hoping alcohol would stay being, I guess. And he really talked about it being, sort of that marijuana would lead, was the most violence causing drug in the history of mankind. He was very racist in his approach, and since a lot of Latino workers that had come from Mexico to work our fields used the drug or used the plant as a medication, and it was popular in the Black culture and in the 30s. He particularly went after it for that purpose. If you're interested in knowing more about it, I would encourage you to look him up. But nonetheless, I think we can blame him for the fact that he at least led to the start of losing 80 years of knowledge that we could have put to researching what this plant could do for people along the way. And that's kind of an unfortunate thing. However, the plant does seem to be getting a bit more love these days, and there's interest in it now that it's been legalized to grow it for fiber. And it's a very, botanically, we would call this a fairly plastic plant. If you plant it densely and encourage it to grow tall and slender, it will take on the expression that you see on the left. And then we can harvest that and utilize the core or the hurd, and we can also use the fibers or the bast, and that's beneficial. It could be potentially beneficial. I won't really talk about that tonight. We can also grow it for grain, and the grain is a high oil grain with a lot of omega-3 and omega-6 in it. One can dehull that seed and use the heart. You can crush it for oil. Many different ways we can utilize that. But for the purposes for me tonight, what I'd really want to try to do is focus more on the medical uses, and particularly CBD hemp and how we can utilize that. And this is a picture of a CBD hemp field in southern Colorado, where I spent a sabbatical leave last year studying how people grow it and utilize it there. So to understand high THC and low THC cannabis, we have to think about plant breeding. And my favorite example of this is that there was a plant called Brassica oleracea that we have adapted, and through plant breeding, we have taken one plant and essentially turned it into broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage, but they're all Brassica oleracea. Just through plant breeding, we've been able to get it to develop different characteristics and different usefulnesses, I guess, utilities, I guess. Well, hemp and high THC cannabis or marijuana are both cannabis sativa, and the difference between the two is simply in the amount of THC or delta-9 THC that is in the plant. And so by definition, hemp has to have less than 0.3% delta-9 THC, and the USDA new interim rule actually wants it to be less than 0.3% total THC. That's including the acid form and the regular form. We'll talk about that more in a minute. But they're basically the same plant. And so if they were growing in a field, you really would have a hard time separating them out just by looking at them. But we can, through plant breeding, breed out the THC if we wanted to, or intermediately breed it out. And we can also upbreed THC if we so chose. This is the particular chemical structure of delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC. This is the cannabinoid, one of many, many cannabinoids in the plant. And this is the one that is particularly psychoactive and makes people have a sensation of being high. And because of this, I think this was one of the reasons why it was so maligned along the way. But this is just one cannabinoid of many, many cannabinoids, certainly more than like 70 phytocannabinoids in this particular plant. And as we look at this particular diagram here, you can see that there is, we have CBD, which is here. And then we also have CBDA, which is the acid form of CBD. And to change from the acid form to the straight form, we will use a heating process, whether that is through smoking or cooking. That's how we effectively make that happen. But each of these components have some value. And again, you can see here I've put some asterisks here, and there has been plenty of research done on these particular uses. And there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, and I don't mean to say anecdotal as in any derogatory way. I think people have found this to be beneficial. We just need more research to really show what it does and what it doesn't do. But we also have cannabigerol and the acid form of cannabigerol, and you can see that there has been some evidence that that these have beneficial properties as well. There's cannabichromene, and there's the acid form of delta-9 THC. The acid form is not get you high, but it has some beneficial properties as well. And then there are the rest of these. So I think we're just now really beginning to understand a little of what this entourage of phytochemicals can do in the body. And I think many people are strong believers that we need a full spectrum product when we're growing and making and utilizing this particular plant to take advantage of all of those different phytocannabinoids as we do the work. In addition to the phytocannabinoids, we also have a bunch of essential oils that are in plants, and these are compounds that are quite volatile. They don't last forever, and so that's why we need to, when we grow the plant and cure it, that we want to keep it in a nice tight container so that we don't lose these compounds in plants. And I don't know how well you can see these different compounds, but they're things like limonene, humulene, pinene, carophyllene, and myrcene. These are all essential oils that are in these plants, and they have a lot of flavor to them. And if anyone out there are fans of IPA beers, some IPAs have more of a piney flavor to them, and the hops and cannabis are very, very similar plants, and they have a lot of similar characteristics. And so some hop varieties have more pinene in them, and some are more citrusy, and they'll have more limonene in them. And some of these terpenes actually affect the endocannabinoid system directly, and carophyllene being one of those. And there's some published research that have shown that. So they can actually further influence the process of how these phytocannabinoids can work to have health effects. So one of my analogies for this maybe isn't a very good one, but I work sometimes in weed management, and we will oftentimes have herbicides that a farmer might put on a field, and particularly the post-emergence herbicides, they'll put a kicker in, like ammonium sulfate, and that makes that herbicide work much, much more effectively than if that wasn't in the mix. And one could look at terpenes as being like adjuvants or kickers that really increase the effectiveness of the particular phytocannabinoid that we're discussing. Okay, so those are in the plant. Now we need to really talk about the biology of the plant because it is a fairly unique plant in its own right. So we call these plants dioecious, meaning that the male and the female plant parts are on separate plants most of the time. And I say most of the time because you can have a female plant, and if it's under stress, it can produce male flowers, and then those male flowers can pollinate the female flower, and you can get some seed. And I'll show you some examples of that in a little bit here. But it's a beautiful plant. It's botanically considered an incomplete and an imperfect flower. Some people would argue with that, and some people think it's an absolutely perfect flower, but but it's incomplete in that it doesn't have all of the plant parts of a typical flower, and but it is it's technically kind of a bract. The dogwood flower itself is a good example of a bract, and what look like petals are actually modified leaves, and this is the core part of the flower. The cannabis flower is really very, very similar, and you'll see that these little specks, that are on the flower and on these leaves here are the trichomes that we'll talk about here. But basically, the plant is basically a calyx and a pistil, and so that's what really composes the heart and soul of the female flower. And these trichomes up here are these little water tower looking structures where that hold the phytocannabinoids and the terpenes that are in the plant. And that's what we really, really care about as we grow and want to grow our hemp in our backyard. And high THC cannabis has the same thing as low THC cannabis. The CBD is in the trichomes, and the terpenes are in the trichomes, and we can use that for our advantage. You can also see that the other plant components here, the stem, the fan leaves, and other parts as well. But basically, in total, we're really concerned about the pistil and the calyx of this particular plant. Now, left to its own devices, if you will, the plant would typically desire to have one major cola, what they call the cola here. It's one major flower at the top of the plant, and then it'll have several other ones around it. And this is a high CBD plant from a grower's field here in Maine. And we can, excuse me, I keep moving this forward because I want to use my pointer, and I don't know any other way to do it except to do it this way. But if you take away the apical dominance, and you can make that plant become a much bushier plant, have more flowers on it, and you can get more productivity, I think, in your backyard with your individual plants. So I think that's we'll talk a little bit more about pruning as we go along. But the reason we're doing that is to make sure that the plant bushes out, gets more flowers, and then those flowers will develop, and that's what you'll want to harvest at the end of the season. I would be remiss to not mention the male plant because, being one of those, we have to recognize it's got some value to it. When we're growing CBD cannabis, it really has no value to us except perhaps in breeding purposes to make different cultivars. But if you're growing it for grain, it is very important. And the male flower will produce lots and lots of pollen, and the pollen is very, very attractive to bees. So hemp grown for grain can be really, really good for the bee population. The pollen goes a long way, however, and so it is very important for us as backyard hemp growers to make sure that we know for sure that the plant we are growing is female and does not get stressed and doesn't form male parts, or what we would call a hermaphrodite. So because if we, for example, were to grow high THC cannabis and it turns out to be a male flower or male plant and it pollinates a hemp grower's field nearby, that could be a real problem, and we don't want that to happen. So it's important to be able to recognize what's a male plant and what's a female plant early in the game. And so what we're going to be looking for are these little hairs that come out at the nodes of the plants, and these are the stamens that will capture the pollen. If you wanted this to happen, it would that stamen would capture the pollen, would take it down into the ovary to affect pollination. But what we want to do is make sure that there is no pollen around. We'll have a female flower that is seedless, or Sinsemilla cannabis is basically what we're trying to grow, or without seed cannabis. These are male flowers, or the male plant, and these are the male parts, and that's why it's an incomplete plant, that the male parts are not in the flower. So so basically, this is what you're going to look for to make sure that your plant is or isn't male. If you see these, you will want to start over or do something different, and get rid of that plant. Again, sometimes you can get hermaphrodites, and this is where you have female parts and male flowers on the same plant, and that is not what you want when you're trying to grow it in your backyard. And if indeed that does happen, you will get seeded flowers, and here you can see some seeds that came out of a plant that a friend of mine generously grew for me last year when I was on sabbatical, so that I would have some CBD cannabis when I got back. And but he did not realize that there were some male flowers, and so I got some pollination in mine. It doesn't really hurt things, it just doesn't help things. So ultimately, you're going to want to have a big, beautiful female plant loaded with lots of flowers, loaded with lots of trichomes, and in order to do that, again, I think the goal will be to learn to trim, and there's lots of resources where people can go to find out how to appropriately trim your plants. I'll talk a little bit about it tonight, but I would recommend that you read up on it more on your own, because it is it can be a little tricky, and you want to get your timing down right and all of that. So so that's the important part of that. And again, so there are lots of medicinal uses for cannabis. And there's high and low THC cannabis, and we're using them both for health-related aspects. High THC cannabis has really been proven to be most effective with chronic pain and spasm control, nausea, particularly as it's associated with pharmaceutical use or chemotherapy, that kind of thing. It's been shown to be effective reducing pressure in the eye with glaucoma. High THC is psychoactive. It will alter your state of mind. And for some people, that's been fun on a recreational basis, or trying to reduce your concern about, and you fill in the blank, whatever it is that you might be concerned about. It's my personal opinion that it's, I don't think it's a great recreational drug. I think it's a much better medication than it is a recreational purpose, but that's for each his own. And so I do think it's worth talking a little bit about how this works in the body. And so THC and CBD both work within the endocannabinoid system within our body. It's part of our central nervous system. And we can thank Dr. Mechoulam, was an Israeli scientist that really first discovered how THC influences our body, and really was the person behind understanding and discovering the endocannabinoid system. And it is an interesting system, and I'm not going to get into any real depth on this, but essentially within our bodies we have this human in fact any mammal that has a backbone or any mammal has this in their system, that they have CB1 and CB2 receptors in the body, and the CB1 receptor is the one that really primarily works with THC, and I'll show some examples of how that works here in a minute. And there are also CB2 receptors, which are influence immune response. And CBD doesn't directly work with either of those per se, but we'll talk more about how it does function in the system, because it functions in more of an indirect system, if you will. But one of the things that we know is that our body produces our own cannabinoid chemicals that make us feel better. And one of those chemicals is called, was named anandamide. It comes from a Sanskrit word for bliss. And when we can generate this in our own body, and CBD has been found to slow the breakdown of anandamide, and so so it tends to make us a little feel better, just generally feel better if it's in your system, and it has been shown through research to slow the degradation of this chemical. One way we can develop or produce anandamide is through exercise, and it's part of one of the chemicals that people get when they get the runner's high, the quote unquote runner's high. And you'll know, if you've been a runner in your life, you'll know that you feel better, but it doesn't last forever. And there are enzymes in our body that break down the chemical once it's produced. And there are certain, it's been thought that there are certain people that they have a lower level of this active enzyme, and they tend to be people that are just happier, they're harder to get all wound up and everything, and that it's been said that may be the reason. But one thing we do know about anandamide is that it does function on these CB1 receptors, and it fits into this little receptor here to make one feel better, and it affects a lot of things like mood and appetite as well. Well, phytocannabinoids like THC also fit into that same receptor in the nerve cell, and so it affects the body in a similar way. You just don't have to exercise so hard, and it tends to last a little bit longer. And so basically what happens is these phytocannabinoids can act like anandamide. Also, there's another one as well. His name is just much too complicated for me to be able to say on a regular basis. So, but these two are example chemicals, and they fit in this little receptor cell, and THC can fit in that receptor cell as well. One of the things that they have found about CBD is that it can limit the rate of where THC can fit into that receptor. And so one might think, well, maybe they work antagonistically to each other, but it's not really that way. There's another type of receptor that CBD sort of fits in, and then they kind of work tandemly together. But the one thing we do know is that when there is a lot of CBD in the plant, it does tend to sit on the effect of the THC. It doesn't allow one to get the peak high so high, which can be beneficial. Like if you're a basketball player and you're flying back across the country and you eat an edible and you get too high, like there was an example of a player in the NBA that had this problem. If they had CBD on the plane and he could have eaten it, he might not have flipped out so bad on the plane, and he had millions of dollars more money than he's going to have now. But so that's kind of how that works. So it's not exactly correct to say that CBD has no psychoactive effect, because if it didn't have a psychoactive effect, it could not stop seizure disorders and things like that. But it does, it's sort of differently psychoactive. And the one thing we do know is it does not make you high, but it tends, we believe it slows the breakdown of anandamide, which is one of the ways it makes one feel better. We know for sure that there is suppression of seizure activity. It has been also proven to have some anti-anxiety effect, and it has some anti-inflammatory effect. And we do know that there is research basis to back that up. There may be some benefit with it in terms of some skin disorders, and again, it affects THC binding in its own sort of unique way. So to sort of visualize that, one can use an example of this, that the cannabinoids like CBD are in and around this, and it might just slow the activity of getting that THC to bind in that receptor site. So for whatever that's worth, that's what we think it does. So you will also find that in states where cannabis products are legal, like in California, for example, a lot of people are making products that have a low amount of THC and a higher amount of CBD, and this is one of the reasons why I wrote a lot of comments to the USDA when they put out their new interim final rule about the new CBD level, because it just doesn't make sense to me that when you have a lot of CBD in a plant and you have a little bit of THC, it's not going to allow that THC to have much effect to begin with. And really, you know, and so if it just doesn't make sense to make that standard more difficult to meet, they should be making it easier to meet it. And because there's really no evidence that 0.3 means anything, it was just an arbitrary level that was determined some time ago to try to separate what was hemp from what was marijuana in its time. So so that's an important component. So again, we would know a lot more if Harry Anslinger hadn't decided to take on his attack on it. We'd have known a lot more if Nixon hadn't had a war on drugs and put cannabis on the controlled substances list. It was considered a gateway drug. I think that has thoroughly been dismissed. There has been no federal funding or really no federal funding to speak of for research. And the University of Maine, I think, is now going to finally allow us to do field research with hemp, which is very beneficial. And we will hope to be working with our farming community this year to try to help them try to do some variety work and some things like that. So what do we mean by a Schedule I drug? That was a drug that was designed to have no medical purpose or no medical benefit to us and a high potential for abuse. So in that list of example Schedule I drugs include things like heroin, ecstasy. I can pretty much, you know, back up, you know, that most of those would fit, but high THC cannabis in that class of drugs, I don't think so. My better choice for a Schedule I drug would be tobacco, because it has no medical benefit and it has a super high tendency for abuse and addictiveness. But that's just me and that's just my opinion. But the medical community, recently there was a publication that was put out by the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine that did a meta-analysis of all of the research that's been done, and they put out this publication at the end of 2017, and I think it's really beneficial because this is not a lightweight organization, and they have really put forward that there's strong evidence for its role to control chronic pain, nausea from chemotherapy, spasticity associated with multiple sclerosis. There's moderate evidence that it improves sleep and sleep apnea, and some evidence that it improves appetite. It can work to slow decreasing weight loss, can reduce anxiety, and potentially reduce some PTSD in some patients. So there is certainly some evidence that high THC, certain cultivars of high THC cannabis can actually exacerbate anxiety. Low THC cannabis has been shown to be very, and high CBD has been anti-anxiety oriented. So keep that in mind as we go along. And the group, I think we really ought to be thankful to the Stanley brothers. They think they were really the group that helped to finally mainstream cannabis on the medical basis when they were able to produce the high CBD, low THC plant. The first one, I think they named after Charlotte. They called it Charlotte's Web, named for this young girl in this picture that was having many, unbelievable numbers of seizures a week, and they put her on CBD oil because it was it did not make her high. It just helped her control her seizures. And this was the first of many low THC, high CBD cultivars that have been bred. And it's really turned out to be very beneficial. In fact, it was so beneficial that GW Pharmaceuticals has produced Epidiolex, which is made from, they grow cannabis plants in a greenhouse. They high CBD cannabis plants. They extract the CBD from and all of the cannabinoids out of the plant. They then purify it to be 99% pure CBD. And they did the research to show that it was beneficial, and the FDA did approve it. It's a very, very expensive drug, I've learned, to use. And it's used in what I consider to be extremely high dosage to help control seizures in children. And what they do is they dissolve this in sesame oil and put some strawberry flavoring, and it's given as an oil to the patient. And it barely got approved because there were some hepatotoxicity or liver side effects that was associated with this drug. And so it is important that we know that that this can be a problem. And so we need more oversight on what is being sold out there. There isn't a lot of oversight. I would like very much to see that FDA, and I know they're fast tracking oversight and rules about what is a safe extracting solvent. And the fact that more is not always better. And there's been some research that has been done out there that looked at products that are for sale on the market, and not all of them were what they were supposed to be. In fact, only one product out of 47 was exactly what they wanted it to be. And there were a bunch of them that didn't have any CBD in it, and then there were some that had way too much CBD in it. So that's really why I've wanted to grow my own, because and grow my own plant and make my own products, because at least then I know how the plant was grown, I know how I extracted it, I know what's in it, and I'm going to make my own materials with it. And so if you do this, you too can get your plant tested. You can figure out what's in it. And many times, this was a maize canatonic, which is the cultivar that I've grown in my backyard. And this was an example test from that particular chemical. And it's got like 20% CBD. And it's got about 0.8% total THC. And so that it would have met our state's criteria for CBD plants up through this year, which was less than 0.3%. I think you can see that there. but the acid form was about 0.5%, so the total together would be almost 0.8%, which would not meet the new designation for what is low THC cannabis. And they're concerned about THCA because it could be converted to THC over time. But again, with the super high level of CBD in the plant, it really doesn't matter. It really doesn't matter at all. And the reality is here that I think 1% THC would be a much better level to set for total THC in a plant, because I just don't think it's going to have any effect. Again, as I showed y'all earlier, the cannabinoids here, the CBD and the other cannabinoids, and CBD particularly, does affect that receptor molecule. And so you can have a fair amount of THC, up to 1%, and really not see any psychoactive activity in terms of getting high. And my example, my analogy to people is really here in that we have, you know, if a colleague came into my office drinking a bottle of kombucha, I'm not going to say, hey, dude, you having a bad day? You know, it's just got 1% alcohol, and you could drink a lot of 1% alcohol and not feel a thing. If they came in drinking a bottle of port, which is 20% alcohol, that would be another game. And so that's kind of my best analogy of what is high THC versus low THC cannabis. And so I think we can have a fair amount of that in there and not really have any problems. So at this point, I'll ask Donna if there's a question or two, and then we'll start talking about growing some plants in our backyard.
We do have a question. I want to remind folks that you can open your chat down at, if you hover your mouse over the screen, in the middle of the bottom of the screen, there's a button that says chat, and it will open another window on your right, and down at the bottom of that window you can type in your question. And we did have a question back when you were talking about trimming the hemp plants. You said, oh, you know, they could, someone's wondering if you could provide some suggested reading materials to learn more about how to do the trimming. Yeah,
I will talk about that in just a minute. Anyway, there's there are lots of websites. If you type in trim a cannabis plant, you'll find some. The Leafly site has some guides to it, and basically what you want to do, and I'll talk about that a little more in detail here in just a little bit.
Someone else wants to know, is there a remedy for hermaphrodites?
You can pull I suppose you could, if you saw it forming and you could tell that a male was forming, you could pinch that off and keep that from happening. The best way to do it, if you're a farmer and you've started with feminized seed and you have, you know, 1,000 plants out in a field, certainly 5% of those are probably going to become hermaphrodites anyway, even if they aren't terribly stressed, just because there's this tendency to go back. So, but I think in the backyard, I think if you keep your plant healthy, particularly if it's a clone of, if you've cloned a female that you know is a female, or you buy a plant that you know is a female from a greenhouse that started from clones, then keeping that plant happy is probably the best way to prevent that from happening.
Okay, another person wants to know, where can we get seeds and which varieties grow best here?
Yes, so one of the things I'm going to fail you is that I wanted to have a list of greenhouses that are growing plants. According to the CBD rules in our state, a licensed greenhouse that has paid their $25 for a license can start a lot of plants for people, and they can have different cultivars. They all have to be hemp cultivars to be sold in a greenhouse, but they will be they can grow them. Griffin Greenhouse is selling on a wholesale basis to the greenhouses. There are certain groups. I know, for example, that I have a friend in Farmington who has a company called Love Grown Hemp, and she's going to be selling plants and seeds this year, and clones. So, but that's just one of many, many potential greenhouses that could. I hoped by tonight to have a full list, and I don't have that, but but call around, and I think you'll be able to find some people that will have them. And because in Maine, you can have 3 hemp plants that are under, you can have a lot of hemp plants under a foot tall, but once a plant is over a foot tall, you can only have 3, and that's in our rules here, as you can see here. And if you have more than that, you got to buy a hemp license, and to do that, you need to contact the Department of Agriculture, Conservation, and Forestry, and ask for Mary, Yerlina, or Gary Fish, and they will get you connected to a license and the license process. But if you're only really 3 plants is more than anybody really needs to have in their own backyard, I think, for the kind of purposes that you want to do. So that's the important part. You want to start with healthy plants that look good.
There's another question on if we have any resources about home extraction process for HTC and CBD.
I will get to that in just a little bit.
Okay,
Yep, that's
several
going to be the
questions here. I'm not sure if you want to do questions or go on with your talk.
Well, I better make sure I can get through, and then I think a lot of their questions will probably get hit as we move along here.
Okay.
So you're going to want to make sure that your plants are super healthy. Look at them carefully when you buy them. There are lots of potential pest issues that you could acquire in bringing that plant back. We know outside that mites are common. There are lots of things that are common out there anyway. You just don't want to start off on the bad footing. And I don't really know what greenhouses are going to sell their plants for. I know that again, there's Griffin that's out there that are willing to sell greenhouses on a wholesale basis, and then those greenhouses can then turn around and sell a plant. And to me, I'm certainly willing to pay $15 to $25 for a plant if it's in good shape and good healthy condition. So my advice to you is to call around, see what you can find, and then I think in a little bit you could probably call the Department of Agriculture, and they should have that list developed in a little bit. And I apologize for not having that. I wrote them tonight right before we got on to see if they had that, and they're working on it, but they just haven't gotten it yet. So let's grow a happy cannabis plant, will you? What do we need to grow a happy cannabis plant? Well, we're going to need a lot of light. We're going to want well-drained soils. We're going to want good fertility. And I think if you provide these basic things and learn a little bit and practice a little trimming, I think you can have some beautiful plants in your yard, in your garden. And, you know, light is one of those hard things. That not everybody is blessed with having a very, a full sun garden. And if you don't, you can still do it. Just realize that the plant gets big and it gets heavy, and it will lean to where it gets its light. And if it's not supported, it can break off, and that would not be a good thing. So if you have a super shady garden but you didn't want to have your sunnier spot of your house have the garden in front of it, for example, well, one could always have pots and be able to move those plants around as the summer changes and the light changes. And you can do it this way. And again, this is no promotion intended. I just use this for an example. But and there are lots of people that on a professional level, this is Love Grown Hemp's production, and they produce in pots because it's easy for them to work with the plant. And so there's nothing wrong at all with growing it in a pot. And you just want to make sure you have a good mix of a good fertile mix in your potting system. You'd want a pro mix, you'd want to add soil conditioners and lots of different things to make sure that your pot was up to snuff that you're growing your plant in. But if you're in a garden basis, one thing we want to make sure is that we have adequate drainage, because cannabis plants do not like to have wet feet. They can get a lot of root-bound, soil-borne diseases. And so if you decide to grow it in your garden, I would recommend having a raised bed that you plant that into, and something like what I've shown here. And then, so that will help in that drainage. If you have a part of your garden that's a little sandier, that would be a good place to put it if light and fertility and all the rest were all equivalent. The other thing that you'll want to do is you should soil test your field, your garden. And we now at the University of Maine can accept industrial hemp, soil samples for industrial hemp. We're still working on being able to do plant samples on it. But if you're growing just for CBD purposes, or if you're growing any cannabis plant, you can use the 130 code as you turn in your soil test form. And these are all of the codes that are on the soil test form, and you'll get recommendations. The most important thing is to make sure that your pH is adequate, because pH affects everything. It's just the basics. And I'm going to only recommend to you to grow this in an organic manner, because we might as well, and there's no reason not to. So, and anybody can lime their soils to adjust the soil pH, and you want to adjust it to somewhere between 6 and 7. 6.5 to 7 is even better. And when you do that, that makes your soil phosphorus more available, and that's a benefit. You'd like your soil phosphorus level to be somewhere in that optimum range, and so anything over 20 is probably optimum. If you're above optimum, we worry about, we could potentially worry about phosphorus movement and affecting a water body. But if there is no water body around and you happen to have higher levels of phosphorus, that wouldn't hurt, because the plant really does like to have a fair amount of phosphorus, particularly during the flowering stage. Your organic matter ought to be anywhere from 5% up. If you happen to have a higher organic matter soil because you've added organic composts and things over the years, that's all the better, because that will produce nitrogen to supply your plant. And the best and biggest reason I can think of to recommend that you do a soil test is that the cannabis plant by nature is a metal accumulator. And if you have used, if you bought land that was once a dairy farm or a field that received a lot of wood ash or other materials through the years, or if your garden happens to be near, you live in an old house and you have a high lead level in your soil, then you're not going to want to plant your plant there, because it is a metal accumulator by your soil. I always recommend a dolomitic lime, because it provides both calcium and magnesium to the soil, which is very important. And so what is in lime is calcium and magnesium carbonate. That's the CO3 designation here. And it's going to react with hydrogen that's in the soil, which is making your soil acidic, to produce water and CO2. And so it magically takes the hydrogen and the aluminum basically out of the system and leaves behind calcium and magnesium, which your plants are going to need. So that is a very good thing. And then we're going to use composts or aged manure or something like that to help improve soil quality and soil health. And I recommend, this is my particular garden, and I'm putting on compost here, and I'm putting on between a 1/2 inch and 1 inch of compost on the bed, and I'll incorporate that and mix it in thoroughly. And then I will plant my plants in it. That's my typical process. And I don't try to use compost and manure necessarily to meet all the fertility needs. I'm doing it more to improve the soil structure and the soil health of that garden. So that's a good thing. And if you have lots of room and you have used cover crops like peas, oats, and vetch, or peas and oats or something like that, you can plant your vegetables or your hemp plant where that cover crop had been the previous year. And if you've used inoculum and you've got good nitrogen fixation with the legumes, it can provide a lot of nitrogen to your plants. So that's a good thing to think about. The other reason I like to have raised beds is that if you're going to do this, and you're going to do this for years and years, which I think you'll probably want to do, you're going to want to have a system so that you're not growing hemp in the same beds year after year. If you do, you will have problems. And I would say from the very first year on, you need to move hemp around in your garden. And so my example here would be, if I have 3 raised beds, kind of like you might have in a garden, I would put hemp in, I'd put maybe 2 plants of hemp in this bed this year, and then I'd plant like a cover crop in the second bed, and then I might have some vegetables in the third bed. And then the next year I'd move that over so that I'd be growing the hemp where we had the peas, oats, and vetch, and that we've incorporated, and that's going to break down and release nitrogen for the hemp plant this year. And then we'll plant peas and oats in this bed in year 2, and we might go back and plant spinach and oats where we had the hemp the first year. And then in year 3, we just tag team this along. It's kind of like a relay race where we pass the baton to the next bed. And this way, we do not promote soil-borne pathogens that might like hemp, and we're moving things around. We're changing plant families in this game, and that's a very important thing to do, because if anybody thinks that cannabis doesn't get disease, you're wrong. I've heard people stand up in meetings and say, cannabis is the perfect plant. It never gets diseases. It doesn't need fertility. It doesn't have insects or other pests. And I'm just going to tell you, it's flat wrong. You have to be vigilant. You have to be on top of this game. And anybody can grow, they call it weed for a reason, but it is not easy to grow well. And so we need to be cognizant of that and do a good job in our work. So assuming you come home with some nice, happy little cannabis transplants to go into your fields, first thing you're going to want to do, if they've been in the greenhouse, is you're going to want to harden them off. And if you go out and put this plant immediately in the ground, it's going to be really, really unhappy with you. So set them outside, let them get comfortable. The first day, wait till it's daylight, put them out, bring them in at night if it's cold, and then eventually you'll leave them out for a day, and then overnight you might start them underneath the overhang of your house where it's a little warmer, and then eventually you'll just leave them on the stoop like I'm describing here. And after they have hardened off for a solid week outside and they're really comfortable, then you're going to want to plant them. When do you plant them is very important, because not only does cannabis not like wet feet, it does not like cold. And it seems like in the great state of Maine that we always have a cold week after the 1st of June. And so a lot of people, what they'll want to do if they're farming it or otherwise, is you're going to want to get out and get those things in the ground when you think cold weather is coming. Let's say if it's a nice day and it's 75 and your ground is 60 degrees, and you see weather coming, and the next 3 days are going to be in the high 40s or low 50s and raining, our tendency would be to say, hey, let's go get that plant in the ground. But once a plant is really stressed, it doesn't recover well. And you'd be well served to pull that plant even back inside or put it next to the side of the house and let it kind of be happy under in the warmth and out of the rain than being really, really chill stressed, because it just won't do you much good. So at least plant after the 1st of June, and I might even recommend even after the 5th or the 6th of June. And then you'll have those plants, and you'll plant them into your raised bed. They'll start to grow. They'll be much, much happier. Spread them around so they have plenty of room to spread out. It's amazing how big these plants get. And you'll think this little tiny plant that you just bought from the greenhouse isn't going to be a monster, but they will grow and they'll get very, very big. And if you plant them too close together, they'll swamp one of them out. So give them plenty of room between them, and that will be a good thing to do. So as that plant begins to grow, there are a couple of things you can do. So this plant in this particular picture here is probably, it may be thigh high at this point. And so you can start to put some trainers in to kind of train the plant. One thing we want to do is to have the most airflow we can possibly have within this plant. And by having a system where you can spread the plant branches out and not have branches touching each other and get more airflow through the plant, you're going to have less likelihood of getting gray mold in your plant. And so I like using this technique where you put 4 canes in the ground and then use P-fencing, and then you can train your plant to grow and spread out. And then we'll want to start to do some trimming. And the first thing you're going to want to do is trim out these lower branches down here, because these are not going to help you out at all. At best, they would make these little tiny little flowers that really don't do anything good. They don't get enough sun, and they're much more likely to get diseased and soil splashing up on them anyway. So go ahead and trim those off. And it's going to be the hardest thing for you to do, because you're not going to want to do this, and you're going to want to keep doing this. You're going to want to keep trimming those lower branches off up until almost flowering time, which usually happens here around the first week of August. So I would recommend, I've gone up at least a quarter of the lower plant has been trimmed out. You don't really want to do it necessarily all at once, because it is a bit of a stress to the plant. But what you're going to want to do is make sure you have some good hand shears that you can go in and do it, and certainly clean those shears between branches and cut on a 45-degree cut so that the water won't hang in the cut and lead to disease, and it'll heal faster and seal off, and everything will be really quite fine. So you can clean the shear off with some rubbing alcohol, and I think that will be just fine if you can possibly find rubbing alcohol after the COVID incidents that we've had here. So that's an important thing. And then along the way, you're going to want to supply what I call immediately plant available nutrients that I think are really helpful to us here. And I'm not overly scientific in this approach, but like fish hydrolysate, you can buy these. They're not inexpensive. They're $30 or $35 a gallon, but it's low analysis fertilizer. It provides nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash in a immediately available form. And to add 2 or 3 glugs to your watering can and water that around the base of the plant when you're going to do a watering of your plant. And I would do that about 3 times before flowering if it were me, and I would use my compost to build the soil health. And if your pH is right and you do this, there's really no need for anything else. But you'll also find that people like a lot of other things. And some people believe in using blackstrap molasses, and they'll add some of this to their water particularly around the time of flowering. And I mean, it took me a long time to figure out why anybody would want to use molasses, because it's, it just didn't. But when I began to understand the use of this, first of all, you want to make sure that you're using non-sulfured or unsulfured blackstrap molasses. If you use the sulfured stuff, it's not good. It won't help you. But what I think it does is it is an immediately available carbon source that when you water it into the ground around your plant, soil microorganisms can utilize that, and they begin to grow and develop. With it comes also these mineral nutrients that your plant does need, and at the same time, the plant will be, the microorganisms will tie up some nitrogen, and when you're in flowering, you really want to promote phosphorus uptake, and you don't really want a ton of nitrogen around. So I think that's part of what is going on there. And the kind of concentration that people will do is it's a dilute solution. It's only like 5 milliliters per 1,000 milliliters. So it's a really dilute solution, but it will help promote microbial activity, and I think that can be good. Other people believe strongly in the use of compost teas, and they'll spray their plants with compost teas. I don't really have a strong opinion one way or the other. It may possibly reduce fungal pathogens. I don't think so, but I certainly wouldn't add it after flowering, because you really shouldn't add anything or spray anything on a plant once it really starts to be in solid flowering. And I think there's also benefits of having cannabis growing with other plants in your garden, because there are beneficial insects in the garden, and if you just had cannabis plants, it might attract more bad insects. And you can check on if you're growing other plants in your garden anyway. It's good to go out because you're going to want to harvest some greens and harvest some other vegetables. So that's a good thing too. And while you're out there, make sure you're studying your plants really close and personal. This is a beautiful psyllid that I found on one of my CBD plants a couple of years ago. And while it's probably not a desirable plant, it sure was beautiful. Look for things like leaf hoppers. Leaf hoppers love plants, love cannabis plants. Look for certain caterpillars. Look for leaf miners. There are lots of different insect pests that could be problematic to you. You may also find that you'll get to watch and witness some really interesting just natural plant dynamics and insect dynamics, where one insect will be predating on another, being a predator to another insect, and that's really fun. So eventually your plants are going to start to get to that point that you think it's going to get ready to harvest. And I think about 100 days is where I usually kind of think about it's getting ready to be going. Most plants, different cultivars will flower for different lengths of time, but usually 8 to 9 weeks in flower is for what most people are trying to shoot for. And you'll keep an eye on those little trichomes, and when they start to ever so slightly go from being clear to being a little creamy looking or a little cloudy looking, you're getting really close. You'll find that the upper flowers are thick and really resonancy, and then I think it's time to do it. You're going to want to have to fight the fact that you're going to want to harvest this too soon, or you're going to want it. You're going to think you're going to want to wait, and you can wait too long, because what happens in Maine, and particularly here, is that the temperatures drop, the moisture goes up, and bud rot is going to be a real problem. If you waited too long, it's actually possible for the plant to want to then go back and change sexes. I've heard about that. I don't know much about that. But by and large, if you go ahead and watch your plants, look for any incidents of gray mold or bud rot, and make sure you're not getting that. At this point in time, if you get a rain, I like to go out and literally shake my plants to try to shake the water off of them so that they won't develop bud rot if I'm around to be able to do it. And if all goes well, most of our hemp research would say that the plant will be about a 9 to 10 pound plant. The stem will be about a quarter of that weight. The wet flower weight will be about 2 to 2.5 pounds, and the leaf weight will be between 4 and 5 pounds. So that's kind of what we're shooting for when we're out there in the field. And again, you're going to want to really be careful for this particular critter. If you see this, go out with a black, looking really closely at all of your flowers. And if you're starting to see this, it's best to just go ahead and pull your plants on in and harvest them, because, or if it's a particularly wet fall, you're better off to bring in your stuff earlier than later, because this is good for nothing, and you might as well use it to start fires in your fireplace. And then when you do harvest, you're going to want to bring them in. You're going to want to hang them upside down and let them start to dry. You can trim immediately and then dry your flower, or you can hang your plants and let them start to dry. About 6 to 8 days or so in this kind of a room would be good. And ultimately then, once it's dried down, you're going to expect to get about 300 to 400 grams of plant. So somewhere between two-thirds of a pound and possibly a pound of dry flower when you're all done, and that would be a very big yield. A lot of people, then you're going to want to start to trim those flowers, and I'd recommend that you have a place to trim onto, because if you just start doing it on your dining room table or something, you're going to have a sticky, horrible mess. So having a tray like this that has a rubber bottom to it, doesn't slide, you can put your branches on there and start trimming them up. You're going to want to have some good, easy to handle shears that are nice to work with, because if you have 3 plants, it's going to take you a long time to trim up all of those flowers, and you don't want to get carpal tunnel or repetitive injury and have to eat your CBD to solve your inflammation problem, right? And I'd also recommend you maybe have two sets of shears, one that you can keep in alcohol and one that you can trim with, and that way when it starts to get sticky and gummed up, you can just switch them back and forth and keep them going. You're going to want to put these into a bell jar, and when you've done trimming your plants, and you're going to want to cure this flower, and that's because the outside of the plant flower is fairly dry from the drying process, but the inside is still wet, and so over time the moisture diffuses to the outside of the plant, and so you need to keep this in a tightly sealed container in a cool, dark place. But you need to open those up about 3 to 4 times a day in the first week that you have it, because you want to let airflow, you want to let that moisture out, and then seal it back up. And so I would do it in the morning. I do it ideally you do it in the morning, you do it at lunch, you do it when you came home from work, and you do it right before you went to sleep. And 3 or 4 times a day for the first week is essential. And then after that, you can kind of chill with them and open them up once or twice a day, and do that process for about a month and let that air exchange happen. Because what that's doing, you got to stop the bacterial and the degradation of the plant and all that enzyme activity. And that's the best way to do it. Keep it in a dark, cool spot, and then open them up to cure it. And then you can put these little moisture, once you get it to the right moisture content, a 62% moisture packet's really good, because they work 2 ways. So if it's a little too wet, it'll pull some of that moisture out. If it's too dry, it'll give some back, and then that will keep your flower in good condition for a long time. And that's really the best part. And then we got to utilize our material. And so my first feeling of this, no matter what you've grown, high or low THC, smoking it is not the best thing for you on a health basis. There has been some good research done that regular smoking does cause some damage to your airways, and it's reversible for the most part. And there really hasn't to date been any real significant link to increased cases of lung cancer, but I'm still a believer that smoking is not good for you. Vaping might be a little bit better. They got these little devices you can vape cannabis in, and you're not getting all of the smoke. You're just pretty much vaporizing the trichome that's in the flower and a little smoke, and maybe a little bit better. But maybe what we could do is make something edible out of our plants, and that's what I really prefer to do. And you can make some super antioxidant rich edibles that I think can be really helpful to you and be particularly beneficial. So what do we need to do this? Well, you can invest in, first thing you got to do is you got to cook your flower to convert the acid form that we talked about earlier of CBDA to CBD. You can buy a particular little toy if you want to do this. And it's not really a toy, but it's a tool. And this is a cooker that they can call these things decarboxylators, because you're decarboxylating your cannabis or converting the acid form to the regular form of CBD. In this, you put your flour, your cooked flour, or your uncooked flour rather, into this little container. It sits inside this cooker. You put the little rubber thing on, the plastic thing on, and turn it on, and it cooks for the right length of time to decarboxylate it, and it keeps the aroma in the cooker, and it doesn't turn your house into a room that smells like overly of cannabis. But there's nothing really wrong with putting your flour on a cookie sheet, cooking it at 240 degrees for about 30 to 40 minutes, and do that decarboxylation process that way. Either way you do it, you got to do that first. And then I take my flour and I put it in a bag, and and what I've been doing lately is I'll do an undecarboxylated half ounce of flour and one that I've decarboxylated, and I'll extract those in alcohol. I like to make a tincture. You can also use oil, olive oil, avocado oil, MCT, medium chain triglyceride oil. The trichomes are soluble in oil and in alcohol. And so you want to use a strong alcohol if you're going to do it in alcohol. And I've just done it in alcohol because that's, for the most part, that's what I've just done. And I'll take the decarboxylated CBD, I put it in the jar, and then I shake that in my hand for 5 minutes. Doesn't have to be terribly aggressive, but just keep it moving. And then I filter that out through a little small filter, so that I have the alcohol containing the CBD extract in there. And then I'll dump that out, and then I'll put the next CBD, I'll pour that back into, I'll take this extract, I put it back in the jar, put more flour of the undecarboxylated into that same alcohol, I shake it again, and then I filter that out. And so ultimately, this is what my product is going, my tincture is going to look like. It's had 16 ounces of ice cold, 151 alcohol, and you want to put that alcohol in the freezer because you get a better extraction with ice cold alcohol and ice cold cannabis to get those things to get the trichomes to dissolve. So I have used basically 28 grams of, or an ounce of decarb, or half an ounce of decarb, half an ounce non-decarb, or you can decarb both, and whichever you want to do. And that is enough material for me to make 6 batches of my edibles when I make them. and each batch makes about 700 to 750 grams of candies. And my recipe that I like to use is this. Anybody paying attention tonight, this is my gift to you. I take a cup of frozen blueberries. I take a cup of frozen blueberries, and you need a good mixer to do it this way. If you don't have a solid mixer, I would not recommend that you put the ginger into it. You can avoid, or the turmeric root. You could put powdered ginger in, or you could put powdered turmeric in, and just use a regular blender. But if you're going to use fresh ginger, and I really like fresh ginger and fresh turmeric root, then you're going to want to use a powerful mixer, like something like a Vitamixer. And then I take a cup of frozen blueberries, I put them in the jar. I take 16 ounces of either blueberry or elderberry concentrate, and I pour that in there. I zest the rind of 2 lemons, and I put that in there with the juice of 1 lemon. And I keep the seeds out of the lemon out, of course. And then I'll put like 15 to 20 grams of fresh ginger that's been peeled and I chopped up, and I put that in there. Just a half a gram no more than around a half a gram of turmeric root. Turmeric goes a long way, and it will stain your plastic container a bright yellow. So you got to be committed to the turmeric for the antioxidant properties. And then you'll want to put a little bit of honey in there, depending on how tart you want your candies to be. And then I put a third of a cup of tincture I blend it first, and then I add the tincture, and I pour it into a saucepan, and I'll put it on the stove to cook it. And you're going to want to watch this material. It's going to want to rise up, and if it rises up and overflows, you're not going to be happy. You'll have lost a lot of material, and you're going to make a terrible mess on your stove. So make sure that you've added your tincture into the material before you put it on the stove, and then turn on your burner or light your stove, and then slowly watch that as it slowly starts to come to a boil. Then back the heat off, and then you're going to want to add 3 tablespoons of gelatin, rounded tablespoons of gelatin. I think that was in the previous part there, but the gelatin is going to make the gummies stick together, and you're going to want to then, you want to do that very slowly, because the gelatin will glom if you don't add it just very, very slowly to the mixture, whisking constantly. So you'll see my whisk over here, and you'll see the gelatin. You can use any kind of beef gelatin you want to in there, but you're going to want to add about 80 grams or 3 rounded teaspoons of that, whisking constantly as you add it. And then I continue to simmer my mixture for about 15 to 20 minutes to make sure all the alcohol blows off. And then I'll take that over to my table, and I'll using an eyedropper, I fill in my molds, which I have actually lined with a little bit of olive oil to make sure that the gummies come back out of them. And I have a bunch of different shapes and sizes. And then once I've done that, I'll take my trays outside to cool, and then I bring them back in once they've firmed up. I pop them out of the molds, and you get lots of different shapes. You can get lots of different shapes and sizes. I then put my my gummies or edibles into a reusable plastic container, and I stick them in the refrigerator. Since they are funny little shapes, you want to make sure you keep them away from any children, because this is medicine. And that's what I do to make my edibles. And I think they are super healthy. I take one in the morning and one at night. And I think they've been beneficial to me. So that's what I do with my CBD gummies. You can make salves, and there are lots of great recipes to make salves. And that CBD can, in that case, you'd want to extract your CBD in a oil base, and then add essential oils and flavorings aromatics to your salve to make them work well. There's some great recipes on that. I don't make CBD oil. I don't want to cook alcohol like that on a stove. I think it's dangerous, so I don't do it, and I don't recommend anybody else to do it, at least not inside. There are CBD oil, companies that make it on professionally using either CO2 extraction or other mechanisms, but I would not recommend that. And I will wrap up this part by saying I think cannabis really is a very useful plant. Yeah, it is technically, it's called a weed, or it's called weed, but it's really not that easy to grow really well. But if you do a good job, you'll be very proud of what you've done. I think you can make some super healthy products that can be beneficial in part of an overall health maintenance and health management process. And I hope that we can keep in touch this year. And be helpful to people that want to try to grow this on their own. So with that, it took me a little longer than I thought it was going to, but I have enjoyed chatting with you, and I'm willing to stay here and answer as many questions as you have, knowing that my wife is going to have dinner for me in a little bit. So with that, I'll say thank you and try to see what kind of questions you might have.
Okay, we've got a few questions, and if there are folks that have to leave us, just know that we'll probably include the questions and answers when we send out the link to the recording too. Somebody wanted to know, should you grow one strain at a time altogether, or does it matter? In other words, if you're going to buy 3 plants, should they all be the same variety?
I would probably, if I had the option, I would go with 3 different ones. I found Maize Catatonic to be a particularly good one for me, but there's Boax and there's lots of different kinds out there, and why not try different ones? And if you want, you can have your product tested and you know exactly what you got. I've really yet to do that. I've done some fairly significant calculating to figure out what kind of dosage I think my edibles have, and I can do that because I'm a trained agronomist. But and I'm supposed to be able to make those kinds of calculations, but I'm making some assumptions as I do that. But I would think that it would be interesting, and you might find that on your own that maybe one variety is more susceptible to disease than another one, and so I would definitely recommend going. And just bear in mind that 3 plants is going to make you more cannabis than you could probably utilize in a year. I know 1 plant for me is all I need. Really, I'll have more than enough to get through this year before I can grow more plants in this summer along the way. So really 1 plant can do it. 2 plants would probably hedge your bets, and 3 if you're just being enthusiastic about it.
What about deer?
I don't know. I don't know if deer will like the plant. I might try to. That's a good question, and I'm just going to have to say I really don't know. I know that I've known people that have grown in areas with a lot of deer around, and they have not as yet had problems. But I would think that the resins would not be particularly palatable to them, but it probably depends on how hungry they are.
Someone wants to know why in your tincture batch you use some decarboxylated and some not decarboxylated.
Great question. Great
flavor question. Or more diverse chemical profile, or?
That's it. Yep. If you remember back to my diagram, the round diagram where I talked about all the different cannabinoids, every one exists both in the acid form and the regular form. And if you look at what's purported with them, you'll see that there are different characteristics for the acid form than the regular form. And particularly if I were growing, I think some of that, as you cook it, some of that will decarboxylate as you're cooking it anyway. But normally you cook this material at 240 for 40 minutes or whatever. And so if you're going to cook it on the stove, you're only going to cook it for about 20 minutes or thereabouts, 20 to 30 minutes under heat. So a little bit of that other part will decarboxylate in, but you're still going to get a lot of the acid forms. And I'm hoping those acid forms will broaden the spectrum of activity and what it could do beneficially for you.
Good. What's the least percent of CBD a hemp plant would need to have it be used for medicine?
That's a good question. I think we can use, so out there in the industry, last summer when I was in Colorado, I visited some farms and they were taking whole plants and grinding entire plants, and they were getting in that 5 to 6 to 7% CBD range. And then they were extracting that, this massive quantity of material through to make an oil to have on the market. If you're not really concerned about keeping your THC level under 0.3% and you make this plant grow and you make it as healthy as you can have it be, it's likely the flower itself, if you're only using the flower to extract, which you should be, that's going to be probably in that 15 to 20% range of CBD, and that's going to be plenty of material, because the way I calculate mine, if I eat one of my little gummies, I think I'm getting where I'm using an ounce of cannabis flower to 16 ounces of extract, the alcohol extract. And I think in that, if I use a third of a cup of extract in my batch, I think my individual gummies are in that 5 to 7 milligram concentration. That's my best guess. And eventually I'm going to test it, but I just needs to be convenient for me to do so. And I'd like to know for sure sometime, but that I think would be, and then that combined with all of the good antioxidants, the good ginger, the good turmeric, I got to believe that's going to be good medicine if you do that.
Someone wants to know where they can find the original strain.
You got me. I don't know.
And Tom Murphy's on. He says, my legislation to allow 3 hemp plants to be grown at home without a license or permit is my gift to all of you.
Yay, Tom. Go, Tom. Yay. I appreciate that very much.
Okay, and somebody's writing here, deer will eat the plants when they are young, but not as they mature because of the smell.
I think that makes a lot of sense to me. I think they just wouldn't like it once the trichomes are there. It's just my sense. I've never had farmers tell me that they've had terrible troubles with deer at this point, but I think that person is correct, and I appreciate their response.
And someone asked, what's the significance of not allowing the male plant to pollute the female plant?
The biggest significance is they're twofold. So when you harvest your plant flower weight without seeds, or with seeds, your biomass is, you got to get rid of the seeds. It makes it kind of a mess. If all you do is have either a hermaphrodite pollinate your flower on your own plant, then the problem really is just that it's messy. And I don't know if it really affects the terpenoid content or the CBD content itself necessarily, but I know on a weight basis that the seeds got to go away. You're not going to use those seeds really for anything, so you just kind of want to get rid of those, and that makes it more problematic. It would be more problematic if you wanted to grow high THC cannabis in your yard, and you have over a third of a mile away, you have a farmer that's actively trying to grow high CBD, low THC cannabis for a living. And if your pollen from a high THC plant floated in and messed up their system, they could possibly have their flower test high for THC, which could be a problem, and their material just wouldn't be as useful when they try to go work with that and try to sell it. So it's really good all the way around to make sure we know we got female plants. If you can find a source that's selling female clones and keep those plants happy, don't let them stress out, don't let them get too dry in the summer, keep them happy, and then I think you'll be fine. That's what we're really trying to strive for.
And we have the 0.3 total THC limit is going to be a challenge for farmers. What solutions do you see for this?
What was the last part of that?
What resolutions do you see for this?
I think for one thing, one thing that's going to happen is that the farmers are not going to be able to grow their plants to the full maturity and full potential. They're going to have to harvest their plants earlier. They're going to have to monitor their CBD and THC content. And once it begins to start to go up at all, they're going to have to harvest early. So that probably means more they're going to probably need to grow more plants and than they would have otherwise. And again, it's such an arbitrary content. It makes me crazy. Honestly, it makes me crazy. A 1% total would make a much sense, in my opinion, based on what I've learned over the last several years playing with this plant and helping farmers out. And we are going to go out and actively try to find out this summer whether there are certain cultivars or strains, if you want to call them that, that have a higher propensity for disease, for bud rot, for those kinds of things, have a higher propensity for insect pest damage. And then hopefully what we can do, we could do this again next year, and I could come back and say my recommendations for the high CBD plant is this one or that one. I know for sure that cultivars that have big colas that are going to hold on to water longer are going to have a much greater propensity to get bud rot, and that's botrytis or gray mold. And I would make sure I would go out with a hand lens and start looking for that. If you have a cultivar that has a lot of that, then you might just, if you have a cultivar that has a bushy flower that's really likely to hold on to water, I would harvest that sooner and don't get greedy. That's what I would say. Just don't get greedy and go ahead and harvest it early.
Good. Someone's hoping that we'll email them places to buy seeds or plants.
Yep.
Someone else says, if you had to choose one reference resource for novice grower, what would it be?
That's a good question. I think that's a good question. I think the materials from, I've used the leafly.com website. I think they have some nice videos. And I think they explain trimming really nicely. That's where I've gone really. And again, they may be featuring and focusing on high THC plants, but the plant's the same plant The principles are the same principles. And I think that would give you some really good information. And I hope we've provided you with enough information tonight to do you some good.
A lot of thank yous in here. Somebody said, what's considered high THC?
Typically today, most cultivars, if you were growing a high THC cultivar that you found some way or another in your yard, to assume 15, 20, even 25% THC is possible. Certainly grown under indoor conditions where you're growing them with under lights and like they're athletes training for, sprint racing, those will be in that 20 to 25% range. I think growing outside slowly, gently in the, maybe 15 to 20% is possible. My guess is probably closer to 15.
Good. Are there enough labs in the state for cannabinoid testing?
There are several labs in the state. That's another area I'm not as familiar with. As I've said, I've never even tested my own, but there's, I think there's one called, there's one in this diagram and that I gave in the talk that was called something like True Leaf or something like that. And I'll go back and see if I can find it real quick.
Well, we can maybe get a list of the labs that have.
Yes, that would be really helpful. I know ProVerd is one in the Portland area. And here it is. Whoops, come back. There we go. Tested Labs was one. I think if you search under Tested Lab, that's one I used in my talk here. That's another one. I'm not exactly sure where they are, but that's where that is. And so I think that will work. Any last ones?
I think we're down at the end.
All right. Well, it's been a pleasure to be with you, and I appreciate your time, and I hope you found this to be useful, and we will be in touch along the way.
Very good.
All right. Thank you, and thank you, Donna, so much.
Yeah, you can stop sharing your screen, and you can see the thank yous that are mounting.
Okay. Stop share. All right. Good.
There you go.
All right. Wonderful.